I could do this intro in my sleep, and sometimes I do. I used to practice it, a bunch of times before every podcast, and now I'm just like, all right, whatever. Hello and welcome to Make It, Move It, Sell It. On this podcast, I talk with company leaders about how they're modernizing the business of making, moving, and selling products. And of course, having fun along the way. I'm your host, Adam Honig, the CEO of Spiro.ai. We make amazing AI software for companies in the supply chain, but we're not talking about that today. Instead, today, we're talking to Martin Liu, the CEO of a company called Commtrex, which is a tech-enabled rail logistics provider. Welcome to the show, Martin.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Hey, just tell us a little bit about Commtrex and, kind of how you got there.
Yes, absolutely. So Commtrex was started back in 2017, and in a prior life, I was a commodities trader for J.P. Morgan Bear Stearns on the coal and environmental markets desk. And we were moving millions of tons of coal a year, and I saw several inefficiencies with how shippers interface with the industry. And the vision was to create a digital ecosystem or a platform that connected the supply and demand sides of the industry. Because I saw that the puck was headed in a direction where eventually there was going to be one centralized platform or database where shippers would have to go in order to be able to connect with all the rail served terminals, ports, warehouses, lessors, and service providers and railroads. And the concept was to create a very simple way for these shippers to connect via marketplaces, create a very sort of vast knowledge base or repository of information so that as the expertise leaves the industry, there is a centralized corpus of knowledge that shippers can always tap into. And then number three, really sort of making connectivity much, much easier. Instead of having to pick the phone up and have to wait to a conference to meet somebody, you can do it all through an electronic platform.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. So you're trading coal and other commodities, real man kind of materials, right? And then a lot of it being shipped over rail. And you realize there was this gap in the marketplace that was really, the shippers and other people were kind of disconnected. And your service kind of connects the two together. Is that how it works?
That's exactly right. So in the trading world, timing is of the essence. So anytime there was a position you wanted to put on, you had to figure out all the different inputs for that delivered cost. So everything from the barging, the freight, the trucking, the rail piece. And the rail piece was always the part that was the toughest to put in place because of the opacity that existed in the industry. And then you wouldn't know who to call if you weren't a part of the industry. And so sitting at one of the largest banks in the world, and I was having issues with it, I just foresaw if I'm having issues, there must be shippers of all sizes that are probably experiencing the same issues. And then as time goes on and you didn't have those relationships, that issue was only going to get exacerbated over time. Just like every other industry that was getting effectively enabled by technology, rail was just probably one of the modes of transportation that didn't catch up yet because in trucking, there were load boards, and in ocean-going freight, there were very liquid exchanges and platforms, even hedging instruments. And in rail, nothing was created at the time that I started Commtrex.
So you're focused on rail, at least initially.
Correct.
And I know there's other parts of transportation that we're going to get to. But tell me a little bit about the rail industry. There's been a lot of consolidation, going on in the industry. How much material is sent through rail these days?
So when you think about the goods that move over land, so there's only two ways really to move freight over land. It's truck and rail. About 40% of all goods that move on land are going to move by rail. And then when you look at commodities specifically, so you think about your consumers and producers of raw materials, that's closer to 60% of all goods that are or commodities that are moved by rail. Rail has significant tailwinds behind it because of the sustainability angle. You take effectively it's 4 trucks for every 1 rail car when you're moving freight. So rail is about 75% more sort of sustainable or carbon friendly than trucking. So right now there is a big push going on in the industry for there to be a lot more conversion of truck lanes to rail lanes because of the significant sort of push that ESG is having across the world.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that when people think about, I commute via train, so I'm, involved with trains a lot, but I feel like trucks are so visible because everybody's driving around and seeing them all over the place that it just feels like everything gets shipped via truck. But, 60% of commodities, that's a pretty high percentage.
Yeah. And the two primary parameters when you're a shipper and you're thinking about moving by rail, what is really the filter as to decide whether it makes sense to move by rail. Number one is distance. So any freight that's moving 500, 600 miles plus, rail is going to be the cheapest per ton per gallon sort of mile, because it really, you don't need. If you're moving coal, for example, coal is at the consumption level. U.S. consumes about 600, 700 million tons of year of coal, and there's just not nearly enough trucks to be able to move 600 million tons of coal across the U.S. And it's just the infrastructure of the U.S. isn't fit for that. So number one is the distance, and then number two is the volume of product that you're moving. So when you're talking about large commodities like coal or oil or chemicals, plastic pellets, steel, lumber, those type of commodities that move in high volume, there's just not enough trucks to be able to facilitate that. So that's why, trains, and then think about where trains go, right? They're going a lot of times in the very rural areas. They're going through mountains. They're going through areas where there's just not a lot of infrastructure. So trains can do a lot of sort of things at a much cheaper cost that trucks cannot do.
So it's cheaper. It's more environmentally friendly.
Correct.
So it sounds great. I mean, of course, you can't have the train come to your door. But besides that, what are the disadvantages of rail?
I think what you just said. So the rail is for the middle mile of the move. That's where rail competes with trucking, is that middle mile piece. But the disadvantage of rail, and this is something that a part of the supply chain industry called transit kind of addresses and solves, is that first and last mile piece. Rail is expensive to be able to implement or to install at your facility. So if you don't have a rail serve facility, if you're not going to invest the millions of dollars into investing into that rail spur and all the different components of that rail spur to be able to facilitate rail coming in and out, the way to be able to move freight by rail is through transloading. So you would truck your product to a transit facility and then load it onto a rail car at the facility. So that's probably the biggest constraint, is just the CapEx investment that would go into being able to move freight by rail at your facility. And then also there's not as many telematics that exist today as there are in trucking, so you can track trucks in real time. Tracking of rail cars is done in near real time, but telematics is something that is coming. But that if you need something and that's a real time tracking capability, rail isn't quite there yet, but it will soon be there, because there are companies out there that are proliferating IoT sensors so that you can track in real time.
Right. You just throw an Apple Tile on it, or whatever those things are called.
That's exactly
but let's go back to transloading, because I'm really interested in this. A lot of people have been talking about transloading. So just in case people aren't familiar with it, just maybe tell people what it is.
So transloading is a pretty simple concept. It's really just moving freight from one mode of transportation to another. So there's two different contexts that you can think of transloading in. Number one is any container that's coming in from overseas. So think containers coming in from China to Los Angeles or somewhere on the West Coast. Those containers get transloaded off of a ship, then onto land, and it gets drayed to a warehouse or put onto a intermodal train, then moved to wherever it's going in the U.S., Canada, or Mexico. So that's one component of transloading. The other component of transloading is commodity sort of transloading, where you're moving actual physical goods. So whether that be liquids, such as oil or chemicals, whether it be hazmat or non-hazmat chemicals, or if you're talking about dry bulk products such as lumber, steel, non-ferrous metals, or any type of metal. So those are the two assets those are the two different sort of buckets of transloading. The one that probably is most obvious to everybody is the containers that you see at any port across the country. The one that's probably less obvious is when you're talking about moving liquids or moving dry bulk products. But it's a very critical piece to the supply chain, and it's something that doesn't have a lot of visibility. But an analogy that I always like to use is airports. The more nodes that you have on the network, so the more regional airports you have, the more people that you can move across the different regions of North America. So for rail, one of the largest and most important mechanisms for them to be able to grow their footprint is transloading, because not everyone isn't going to be able to invest or justify the spend on CapEx for putting rail spurs facilities. But if rail does make sense because the volume is there and then the distance is there, transloading is the way for them to do that. And that's why there's a lot of investment going on in right now, not only from the rail side of the business, but also from the shipper side. There's a lot of diversification that's going so that they don't have to rely so heavily on just trucks moving their product either first, middle, or last mile. But now everyone, post-COVID is trying to create more diversification and less concentration of exposure into one mode of transportation.
Gotcha. So if I'm a ball bearing manufacturer, and we have customers in the ball bearing business, I don't mean that like in a funny way. It's just something that's super important. Actually, there was a lot of news about ball bearings recently because there's a bit of a shortage in the war in Ukraine, but that's a completely different topic.
Right.
But if we're making ball bearings, we might just think, oh, well, trucking is the only way to go. But with transloading, this is the opportunity for us to now get the benefits of the environmental approach as well as the lower cost of rail transportation.
That's exactly right. So flexibility in the supply chain, I think COVID really highlighted how inflexible the supply chain was. And it worked great, prior to COVID. I think things were, obviously there were their bumps. There are still blind spots as far as visibility is concerned in the supply chain. But when, you have a black swan event like COVID happen, and, there's a lot of issues with being able to get product to, from origin and destination, all of a sudden you have to look really hard at how you're moving things, because you can't think that there is not going to be another black swan event, that comes in. And now that you have shippers, whether it be a big box store or a commodity consumer producer, and now they're getting ahead of that. So they went from a just-in-time model, which was kind of your more traditional sort of way that you manage supply chain, to now what they call a just-in-case model. So you have more areas where you're having products staged, so that if there was this major disruption or interruption in your supply chain, you can quickly flex to another mode or to another sort of hub-and-spoke part of the country.
And we've been talking with a lot of people who've been focused on bringing manufacturing back to North America, too. I mean, how is that impacting the rail market from your perspective?
That's a significant tailwind for rail. There's a lot of onshoring that is happening. In particular, you're seeing a lot more facilities or manufacturing plants coming up in Mexico. Obviously, the reason why people offshore is it's all cost, right? It's all labor cost. When you're thinking about where to put that to the auto manufacturing facility or where to put that chemical facility, cost is always going to be, top of mind for you. But not only is cost top of mind, but you're also thinking transportation. So, volatility was extremely high during COVID. So, and not even pre-COVID. So if you're moving anything across North America, instead of having to rely on that ocean freight market being consistent and having those volatility, the pricing for that market to not have as many swings, there's a lot more that you can control if you're working within the parameters of North America. And I think that just, overall politically, there's a real higher level sense of how can we keep jobs in North America. And I think, you couple that sort of sense of wanting to do more here in North America, not only for economic reasons, but for political reasons. I think there's a major tailwind for rail, because the primary way that you're going to be able to move those products that you're onshoring in North America, particularly because you're dealing with long distance moves and typically high volume moves, rail is going to be probably the biggest beneficiary of that movement.
Right, and I think combining with the transloading, where you can basically use both, rail and traditional trucking to carry products, it makes it a lot more attractive for people. Because you're right, the container cost, coming from Asia, I mean, it's tripled, it went in half, it went up, it went down again. Right. I mean, it's just been all over the place.
That's exactly right. So, at its peak, it got on to $20,000, and now you're looking at a, $1,000 to $2,000 container cost from Asia to the west coast of the United States.
The rail prices have been more consistent? Is that
the rail prices? Yes, exactly. There's not just that much volatility. You have a closed network, and you have 7 Class 1 railroads, and then you have your Class 2 and Class 3 railroads. So it's a pretty contained environment versus the ocean, and you have several major ocean carriers, and it's a much less volatile market because you have a much more sort of contained network that you're moving goods and volume on. So in some respects, I think that is very helpful, because I think supply chain is all about being able to project what that delivered cost is. And, that volatility swing, whether it be in trucking or whether it be in ocean freight, you don't experience that same sort of swings in volatility that you do in rail.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, let me ask you another question. So I know in a lot of our customers, we're seeing sort of a generational change. Maybe in a family business, the more senior family members are kind of stepping back, and there's a new generation coming up, and they're implementing new things within the businesses. What are you seeing in your sector that way?
That is actually, I'm glad you touched upon that, because that was the primary investment thesis when we started Commtrex at the beginning of the company, when we were raising our first round of investment capital. That was the one of the main theses that we were sort of talking to investors about, was the fact that there was a major generational shift that's happening. Back in 2017, we were looking, forward looking, and 2020, it was going to be 50% of the global workforce were going to be millennials. And by the time you got to 2025, 75% of the workforce would be millennials. Now, the thing about millennials are they're the first generation of digital natives that exist. And obviously, it only has become more progressive now with the Gen Y and Gen Z generations. But if that truly is the case, I think an important stat that really sort of stood out to me was the average amount of time that a baby boomer stays in one company or in a job is 8 to 9 years. Gen Xer, which is the generation I'm in, is 6 to 7 years, and a millennial is 2 to 3 years. So if you just take that stat alone and you take that and couple that with the fact that the generational shift is happening at an enormous amount where, half, if not, 2/3 of the workforce will be millennials, you're never going to have a 15 to 20 year fleet manager or supply chain manager ever again at one company. And historically in rail, most of that is in-sourced. So that knowledge, those relationships, those connections that they have, that was never historically an issue because that one person knew their railroad rep or their lessor rep or whoever it is on the service provider side to deal with. But if you were to take that same sort of position or seat, and that knowledge goes away and leaves that particular company, and there's no succession plan or there's no institutionalized knowledge, there's no very easy way for them to be able to pass that knowledge and pass those connections along. So that was what we saw sort of back in 2017 was there was going to be a database or a repository of information, and someone was going to need to create a marketplace so that if you stepped into a seat at, you name the big box retailer consumer, you wouldn't have to know rail for the past 10 to 15 years to be able to understand all the dynamics of moving by rail. You wouldn't have to have all the relationships there. You could log into a platform, have visibility into the supply side capacity, be able to look at prices and data, and then be able to connect with the supply side. And, the other thing we do is we also have a resource center. We have newsletters that go out to over 3 times a week. And what the idea was we need to create this education and this format so that if you're new to rail, you don't have to rely on speaking with that person who's been doing rail for 15 to 20 years. You can go to a centralized repository and be able to learn about it, educate yourself on it, go into a marketplace, connect, negotiate, and be able to execute a transaction with very limited experience and knowledge in rail.
So let me make sure I understand this correctly. So for a big box retailer, let's just call it Target. There was somebody or a couple of people who knew everything about rail and they had it all in their heads and they just knew, what to do. But the problem is that, over the coming number of years, a lot of these people are retiring and, it's a little bit of a specialized skill. And so there was no real good way for people, the next generation, to really know how to do that.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and just to put another finer point on that, versus trucking, you could pick the phone up and you can call a 3PL, a 4PL, you can call a freight broker and have a product moved from Chicago to LA off of a phone call and a quick onboarding document credit check. That isn't possible in rail. In rail, you would need to be able to establish a credit line with the Class 1 railroad. You need to be able to figure out how you're going to get rail cars, whether that be system cars from the rail, or if you're moving liquids, you need to figure out how to source those cars from a lessor. You need to be able to figure out transloading. If you don't have a rail serve facility, you need to find a transloader or a port or a warehouse you can move that to. You need to understand how to manage the freight rates and how to manage demurrage and how to manage storage. There are all these elements that you need to figure out. And this is one of the reasons why we actually started a logistics services or managed services business last year, is because a lot of about 1/3 of all the shippers that use our system have never even moved freight by rail before. And, at the end of the day, if you're a shipper, the goal is to find the cheapest, most delivered cost, and most efficient way to move the product.
Sure.
And their goal isn't to train and become the expert in rail. What they really want to do is they want to be able to find a platform or find a provider they can work with that they know they can trust to be able to move that freight and product, while also being educated enough to be able to communicate to the VP or to the management why they're choosing to move that freight by rail. So, the managed services component with the technology and data, all three of those together was really the issue we were trying to solve.
So it's less expensive, more environmentally friendly, but a little bit harder to do in a way.
Correct.
Then. Yeah, especially
Absolutely.
Without that specialized knowledge.
That's exactly right. And I think once you do have that specialized knowledge historically, that did become an edge for your business because you did have that ability to flex on rail, where if you didn't know how to do that, you couldn't take advantage of those cost savings that you get with moving freight by rail. So that was really what we were trying to solve. And to speak to the generational shift, that was the reason why a lot of shippers were actually coming to us, because if you knew rail, there was no reason to be able to use a platform like us. And then all of a sudden what happened was you had this generational shift, probably not too different than what you're seeing with your platform, that the next generation comes in. They said, well, how can we do this in a better, more efficient, more effective way? And then when they speak to a Spiro or to a Commtrex and they discover how much efficiency and how much data and how quickly they can make decisions based on data-driven decisions, it becomes a no-brainer for whatever the spend is. It's a drastic transformation for that business.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It's a very analogous to our situation. A lot of, the customers that we're working with, they're dealing with retirement of their sales teams. And these are guys who've just been working a territory for 30, 35 years, 40 years, and they're going to leave and retire. And, frankly, the company doesn't have a relationship with their customers. The salesperson does. And so, getting that institutional knowledge, as you put it, is super critical. So it's like we're kind of approaching the same sort of issue that way.
That's exactly right. And the knowledge that you're capturing in the CRM system, the knowledge that we're capturing in our platform really is all driven around data. And the way that we make things easier to be able to have data at the fingertips of our shippers is the same thing that you're doing to be able to create a very quick way for shippers to be able to have, or for your customers to have access so they can make quicker decisions when they're trying to move a commercial deal or a commercial opportunity along the pipeline faster.
Yeah,
so very similar.
It sounds very, very similar. Now, let me ask you this. So I know, like a lot of our customers don't feel like they're technology forward businesses, and it sounds like in rail it's similar. But even in these industries, I feel like AI has really grabbed people's attention. So what has been the attitude in your world about AI?
I think AI hasn't really hit home yet as far as how transformational AI is going to be, not just to our industry, but to every industry and to all of our personal lives. Obviously, with the proliferation of ChatGPT 3 and now 4, which just came out, a few months ago, it's really sort of changing the way people do things, and changing the where really that expertise needs to lie in order to be able to execute, sort of effectively. So I do think that AI, and I always reference, when I think AI, I think, it sounds like a very complex topic, but I boiled AI down to really simply, it's just the science of decision making. How can you make decisions more effectively, using as many data points as possible? And what AI is really just a co-pilot for the decisions you're making in whatever context you're making them in, whether that be trying to decide, what's the best, sort of restaurant to go to for your date night with your wife, or whether it's, who's what's the best mode of transportation to move, or how should I more effectively be able to move a sale on the pipeline. Everybody needs a co-pilot to help do things that they can't do as quickly. And, I think this is probably going to be the most transformative technology outside the internet that we're going to ever see in our lifetime.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can see, we see applications of it all over the place. I'm sure you do too. But to help people, come up with the routing and planning and optimization of shipment, I think there's a lot that the AI can be doing in that area.
Absolutely. And the timing of AI coming out, there's no coincidence that there's this major uptick in people using AI, even though it just came out so quickly, and the generational shift that's happening. As you come into, as this next generation comes into these seats, these business to business sort of seats, where there's a lot of industry knowledge, kind of like you were saying, where there's this generational knowledge that typically was there, but then someone jumps into that seat and they don't have that background, that knowledge, there's relationships. How do you sort of make up for that? How do you compensate for those 10, 15 years of experience? Well, how you do that is you lean on data, and you lean on data that's going to be effectively processed in seconds through a co-pilot, in the form of AI. And so for us, that's a component of technology that we are working on integrating into our system, because I think, no different than your industry and how you're working on integrating AI into the CRM platform, we are also figuring out how can we create a co-pilot experience so that when someone's looking to lease cars, when they're looking to transit, when they're looking to store cars, when they're looking for a terminal, a port, or warehouse, they don't have to go try to consume information quickly, understand it, process it, talk to people. In theory, that can all be done through a mechanism called AI.
Yeah. No, it's very exciting. I totally agree with you. I feel like we're right on the cusp of what's going to happen with it. And I think one of the exciting things for me and people I've been talking with is that nobody really knows exactly how it's going to play out, So that'll be super interesting to see.
Yeah, and I do think that there's a lot of caution that folks at OpenAI who created ChatGPT and others that are shepherding the AI sort of technology along. I think there's a little caution in making sure that it doesn't roll out too quickly.
Sure.
Because something that I think comes up quite often is how is the next generation going to learn to think if they can go to an application and the application does all the thinking for them. Unlike when we were growing up where, we actually had to go to the library or you had to lean on books and you had to learn in order to write that essay in college. It's different now. I mean, how does a teacher distinguish whether AI or ChatGPT wrote an essay versus whether an actual person wrote the essay? That's an unknown.
There's a lot of trust issues involved in AI. I mean, I know that anytime the AI is going to make a recommendation, whether it's about who to call or, the best path to take for, something in logistics, like if it gets it wrong, that's a major issue, And so I think one of the challenges that we've been seeing with the ChatGPT style large language models is they do have a tendency to hallucinate a little bit and just pull stuff out of their ear, so to speak.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head. I think that is probably in the near term, that's probably the greatest danger that we face is you become to rely on the information and data that's coming through ChatGPT, and it provides you with so much information with such conviction that it's correct. And obviously, conviction is used loosely because it's just text that's coming at you. But you rely on it, and you think that when you put in a question that it's going to give you something that's factual. Well, if I go to ChatGPT and ask who is Martin Liu, CEO of Commtrex, it said I worked at these banks that I never worked for, and it also says that I had experience, at other companies that I never worked for. It captured, maybe 50, 60% of the information correctly, but if you didn't know that, if you weren't Martin Liu and you were just typing that into ChatGPT and that was the information that you got as a response or reply back, you would not know if that was true or not, and you would question whether my profile on LinkedIn was actually accurate or not.
Yeah, no, I like to tell people that it's 100% accurate 70% of the time. That's the way that I really feel about it. So, in some domains that's acceptable, but I think where you and I come from, I think we demand a higher level of fidelity.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're, you're the younger generation coming through, education or through your career, and obviously it's just going to get sort of more refined over time. You're not going to be able to. How are you going to be able to distinguish whether it is true or not when that becomes, almost gospel for you when you're making decisions because you're relying upon the integrity of the data to be correct or accurate?
No, I'm with you. Hey, Martin, this has been awesome. I'm so happy you were able to make it onto the podcast. Really appreciate your coming here today.
Well, thank you for having me. Hopefully this was enlightening for the audience. And I know rail is a very niche topic, niche in transportation supply chain because it's not as sort of widely known as trucking or ocean freight. But I absolutely appreciate you having me on to talk about what we're doing and how we're really trying to add value to the rail and logistics space.
Yeah, 60% commodity shipment. I don't think that's, small. I mean, I think we need to, get more people thinking about it, especially for the environmental benefits, that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And I always tell people, just look around your house or look around your office or restaurant. Every single thing, whether it be the electricity for the lights or the wood for your for the walls or the metal for your desk, everything that you're using to be able to sort of function in life, those are all driven by commodity inputs. And they all got to you, most likely in some form or fashion. It touched rail at some point in that move. So it really is a critical component of the supply chain and the economy.
Right. Just hopefully touched it in the car, not on the rail itself. That's all I want to say about that.
That's exactly right.
Gotcha. Well, once again, Martin, really appreciate your coming on the program.
Well, thank you again for having me. I'd love to be back sometime. Thank you.
Right on. As a reminder for our listeners, you can find every episode of the Make It, Move It, Sell It podcast at spiro.ai/podcast. What I recommend you do is, subscribe. If you think that it's a good podcast, why not? Maybe give us a good review. Martin, what do you think? Should people give us a good rating?
100%. When they have
100%.
Topics like rail, where that they're going to educate people, absolutely everybody should be given raving reviews about the podcast.
Exactly. Just do it for Martin, if not for me. But thanks for everybody for tuning in, and we look forward to speaking to you at the next episode.